Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. It was a morning painted in the restrained hues of English spring. Pale skies, polite sunlight, and the faint perfume of earth after last evening's rain. The villagers of St. Mary Mead, with hats tilted just so and gloves immaculate, made their familiar procession to chapel, their footsteps quiet on the flagstone path, as if in deference to the sanctity of the hour. The local vicar, a gentleman prone to coughs and sermons that ran a shade too long, had taken ill, and in his place stood a visitor, Reverend Simon Blythe, recently come from the north. He was of middling height and middle years, though there was something about his bearing, a certain tightly fastened restraint, that suggested a man less at peace with God than at odds with his own soul. He spoke with precision and gravity, his voice deep and unwavering at first, choosing his scriptures with the solemnity of one weighing his own conscience. Yet there was a curious intensity behind the homily. His gaze wandered not across the congregation but as though searching for something, someone, not quite present. Miss Marple, seated near the front with her gloved hands folded neatly, did not watch him as others did. She listened, of course, but more than that, she noticed the brief tremor in his hand as he turned the page, the pause before uttering the words, "the wages of sin," and the subtle way his breath caught when the choir rose behind him. It was a voice trained in righteousness, yes, but trembling now with a different weight. And as the candles flickered beneath the painted arch above the altar, there came a moment, brief yet unmistakable, when something in his expression faltered. The silence that followed the faltering of Reverend Blythe's voice was not the usual reverent pause observed in houses of worship. It was the kind of silence that tightens the air, draws brows together, and causes hands to clutch handbags just a little tighter. He had stopped mid-sentence, his voice suspended like a dropped curtain, then placed one trembling hand upon the lectern. The other moved to his breast as though a sudden weight had made itself known. There was a collective shift in the pews, followed by the startled rustle of hymnals falling to the floor. Miss Marple, ever modest in movement but swift in thought, was already rising. By the time Reverend Blythe crumpled behind the pulpit rail, she was beside him. Others rushed in, Dr. Gibbons from 3 rows back, and young Mr. Finch, who fancied himself helpful. But it was Miss Marple who knelt first, adjusting the clerical collar that had twisted during the fall. His skin was pale, not with illness alone, but with something deeper, an inner affliction beyond fevers or fatigue. For a moment his eyes fluttered open, and in that brief window of consciousness, he reached up and caught her wrist with surprising strength. His lips parted, and in a voice hoarse but deliberate, he murmured 6 words, barely audible beneath the vaulted ceiling. "God knows what I've done." Then he closed his eyes once more. It was a strange thing, Miss Marple thought later, how the human heart can discern between the babblings of delirium and a confession spoken from the threshold of guilt. She said nothing aloud, of course, not yet, but in the tilt of her head and the thoughtful narrowing of her eyes, a quiet inquiry had already begun. By Monday morning the news had settled across St. Mary Mead like a fine frost, cold, lingering, and discussed in detail over buttered toast. At Mrs. Bantry's it was remarked that some men simply aren't suited to the pulpit. At the grocer's, Miss Hartnell speculated a heart condition, and at the post office, Mrs. Tilling confided she never trusted a clergyman who didn't blink when you mentioned judgment. Miss Marple, meanwhile, did what she always did in such matters. She listened, not just to words, but to the spaces between them, to the hesitations, the too certain reassurances, the choice of what was said over what was not. She had seen many men faint, and more still who bore private sins under public colors. But there was something else about Reverend Blythe's collapse. It was not the sudden kind, nor the theatrical fall of a man yearning for sympathy. It had been gradual, restrained, as though the body, much like the soul, had reached its limit. As she stirred a teaspoon of marmalade into her morning tea, she recalled the weight of his hand on her wrist, the fever in his eyes, and those curious 6 words, not a prayer, not a plea, a statement, resigned and resolute. That afternoon, Miss Marple wrote a short note to the vicar's wife, offering her services, should any tending be required. But even as she folded it, her thoughts turned, not to illness, but to penance. Some maladies, she knew, had nothing to do with the heart, and everything to do with the conscience. It was just past midnight when the sound pierced the stillness. Low, deliberate tolls, 12 in all, ringing from the chapel belfry like an echo from another century. The villagers, though still awake, looked to their clocks in mild alarm. Those already asleep stirred beneath their quilts, registering the sound as if in some half-formed dream. And those most inclined toward a superstition whispered of portents and of spirits not yet laid to rest. But it was Miss Marple who, in the quiet of her parlor, sat quite still with her embroidery resting untouched on her lap. She did not look to the clock. She did not rise. She merely tilted her head ever so slightly and listened, because she knew something the others did not. Bells, after all, do not toll themselves. The arrival of Reverend Simon Blythe to the vicarage was received with the subdued civility characteristic of St. Mary Mead. The villagers, ever courteous, were prompt in extending polite welcome, yet each did so with a natural reserve, for while they embraced change in theory, in practice they regarded it with faint suspicion. The Reverend, who came at the request of the bishop's office to tend the flock during Canon Weatherby's convalescence, was the subject of much restrained observation. He was a man of a certain bearing, tidy in appearance, well-spoken, and courteous to a fault, but possessed of a certain nervous formality. He declined wine with his supper, spoke sparingly at meals, and though he read evening prayers with admirable enunciation, did so with a gravity that bordered on the severe. His smile, when it came, felt rehearsed. His hands often sought the comfort of his pockets, and when complimented on the chapel's modest stained glass or the gentle beauty of the yew tree walk, he replied with a tone that managed to sound appreciative and uneasy all at once. Mrs. Weatherby, who had seen to the vicarage's affairs since her husband's illness, mentioned to Miss Marple over tea that the Reverend seemed quite decent but terribly tired. Miss Marple had merely nodded and murmured something about the burdens of clergy life, but privately she wondered whether it was fatigue or something heavier that shadowed the man's eyes. The villagers noted little things: how he avoided lengthy conversations with the elderly, how he left the breakfast table early, and how his gaze lingered too long on the small, unremarkable portrait of the former vicar's daughter that hung in the hallway. None could name precisely what was amiss, but in St. Mary Mead, such impressions seldom went unremembered. It was during the following Sunday's evensong that Miss Marple, ever attuned to matters of the soul that revealed themselves in trifles, observed something peculiar. The congregation had reached the third hymn, "O Thou that hearest prayer," when Reverend Blythe having led the first verses, fell silent. His hands remained folded over the lectern, his mouth still, even as the voices of the faithful swelled gently behind him. To any other observer it might have seemed a moment of thoughtful reflection, but to Miss Marple it was unmistakably a pause of discomfort. She noted, too, how his gaze drifted not toward the cross or the choir, but toward the north wall, where the organist's ledger of former hymn selections rested untouched. Later, outside the chapel, Miss Hartnell, never one to suppress a memory, greeted the Reverend and remarked, without malice but with great precision, that she believed she had seen him years ago at St. Aldhelm's home in Wiltshire. At this, a strange stillness passed through him. He smiled, yes, and uttered something forgettable, but his voice had dipped, and a certain rigidity overtook his frame. Miss Marple did not speak of it, but she did not forget it either. By Tuesday, the subject of Reverend Blythe had passed through several parlors, over scones, through knitting circles, and into the shaded conservatory of the Women's Guild. In none of these quarters was he spoken of with unkindness, but the gentle current of speculation had begun to flow. Widow Carta, a sharp-eyed woman of 73, and once a matron in an infirmary near Salisbury, was among the first to speak plainly. Over biscuits at Mrs. Price Ridley's, she recalled with certainty that she had encountered the Reverend, though not in clerical garb. He had a different name then, she said thoughtfully, and a rather different manner too. Her tone was not accusatory, merely intrigued. Others offered their own recollections, pieced together from memory and suggestion. Mrs. Bantry, upon hearing of the conversation, dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but nonetheless found herself wondering aloud to Miss Marple whether some men, perhaps, come to the cloth after they've made a hash of something. Miss Marple, pruning a miniature rosebush that morning, said little, but she did pause, momentarily, when her shears caught upon a thorn that had not been there the day before. It was not in her nature to indulge in idle talk, but she had long learned that gossip, when sifted carefully, often revealed the shape of truth, and she could not help but wonder, what had this man been before he chose the cloth? It was Lily, the vicarage maid of slight frame and serious expression, who made the quiet discovery. She had been instructed to air out the guest bedroom, which Reverend Blythe now occupied, and in the process of sweeping beneath the small escritoire near the hearth, her broom caught upon a floorboard that rose just enough to suggest it had once been lifted with purpose. She hesitated, then pried it up with a hesitant finger, revealing a small fabric-wrapped parcel. Inside was a silver locket, aged but intact, its surface engraved with a modest vine pattern. Lily, curious in the manner of her youth, opened it carefully. One side bore the image of a girl, perhaps 12 or 13, with solemn eyes and ribboned hair. The other contained a lock of auburn hair, pressed flat behind the glass. No inscription marked it, no initials, no date. She showed it later that afternoon to Mrs. Weatherby, who took it with some surprise and placed it in her desk drawer, with a murmured promise to ask the Reverend. But Miss Marple, having come to the vicarage with a basket of scones, glimpsed the locket in passing, and noted something quite different. Not the girl's likeness, nor the hair, but the faint impression of a broken clasp, as though the locket had once been worn and then forcibly removed. That Thursday afternoon brought tea at the Grange, where Miss Marple, a great believer in the value of ordinary conversation, sat with Mrs. Bantry beneath a gently ticking clock and a silver tea service polished to a fault. The talk, as it so often did, meandered from rheumatism to geraniums, before circling back, without effort or design, to the subject of the Reverend Blythe. Mrs. Bantry, who never disguised her relish for stories best left in whispers, leaned slightly forward and remarked that the name, St. Oldhelms, had stirred something in her memory. "A girl's home, somewhere in Wiltshire," she said, buttering her second slice of seed cake. "There was a bit of trouble, I recall. A girl went missing. Whole matter was hushed up, of course. Nasty business. And wasn't there a young chap, clergyman of some sort, who vanished shortly after?" Miss Marple listened, her fingers lightly encircling her teacup. She remembered the incident, vaguely. A child who disappeared under suspicious circumstances, and the quiet withdrawal of a curate who had been, at the time, newly ordained. Curious, Mrs. Bantry added, how the Reverend avoided mentioning his former parishes. One would think a man of God might be proud of them. Miss Marple did not reply, but she did take a second helping of seed cake. By Saturday morning the village awoke to news that disturbed even those inclined toward skepticism. Widow Carter had been found in her back garden, slumped near the rosemary hedge with her apron torn and one wrist badly bruised. Dr. Gibbons had been summoned and declared it a fainting spell, though the marks upon her skin suggested more than mere clumsiness. She had no recollection of what occurred, only that she had gone out with secateurs and woken some time later, with her knees damp from the earth. Miss Marple, informed of the incident over Morning Post, looked out upon her own flower bed, and quietly noted the season's early rosemary had begun to bloom. Widow Carter had always possessed the kind of constitution that defied her years, sharp of tongue, nimble of foot, and untroubled by ailments that felled women half her age. It was therefore all the more unsettling when she failed to appear at the Tuesday market, and news spread that she had not only been found prone in her garden, but had remained unwell since. Miss Marple, ever tactful, paid a call under the guise of delivering a lemon sponge. She was received by the widow's niece, who fussed unnecessarily, and offered vague assurances that her aunt was merely tired. But Miss Marple, with the quiet persistence that so often preceded her clearest deductions, asked to see the lady herself. The widow was alert enough to recognize her, and even managed a weak smile. But as Miss Marple bent to adjust the bedding, the old woman's eyes fluttered shut, and her lips formed words that came as little more than a breath. "He buried her beneath the rosemary." The words might have been dismissed if spoken by anyone else or in any other context, but Miss Marple, rising slowly with a gentle nod, felt a strange weight settle over her thoughts. In St. Mary Mead, nothing whispered by those near sleep should be taken lightly. The following morning Miss Marple took a detour during her customary constitutional. Her route, though unannounced, brought her within view of Widow Carter's garden, where the rosemary bushes stood thick and tangled beneath the southern wall. The growth was old, planted decades prior, and largely left to its own wild designs. But what caught her attention was not its age, but the curious disorder of a particular cluster. The soil there had clearly been turned. Miss Marple, no stranger to the habits of gardens or gardeners, noted the difference at once. No planting or pruning explained the bare patch, and though she would never dream of trespass, she felt no impropriety in stepping lightly along the edge to peer more closely. There, just beneath the surface, the corner of a cloth pouch protruded. She lifted it delicately and opened the drawstring. Within lay a child's rosary, its beads pale pink, its cross worn smooth by time. But one bead, she saw, was missing. She studied it for some time before placing it in her reticule. In isolation such an object meant little, But married to a whispered phrase and a man's trembled sermon, it began to form something darker. A thread, perhaps, tied to a girl who had once knelt in prayer and had not been seen since. By the next Sunday, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead's chapel had shifted subtly, as such atmospheres often do, not from any single event, but by accumulation. The Reverend's voice, once solemn but steady, now carried a cadence tinged with urgency. Where once he spoke of duty and charity, he now thundered of sin, of reckoning, of fires unseen, and judgment drawn not from man, but from something far more enduring. It was, as Mrs. Bantry observed afterward, rather more Old Testament than we're used to. Miss Marple, seated in her usual pew, listened intently. It was not the words alone, but the rhythm of them, the way the Reverend gripped the lectern a little too tightly, how his gaze flitted toward the windows when he spoke of divine retribution. There was a fever behind his phrases, a strain beneath the scripture. When he mentioned the burning of the chaff, his voice cracked, and no one failed to hear it. Some said it was illness, others the weight of recent strain. But Miss Marple, whose faith lay not in appearances, but in patterns, thought instead of the guilty, who repent aloud when silence no longer protects them. And something within her told her the fire was not in the sermon, it was in the man. In the days that followed, Miss Marple, under the guise of a modest inquiry for the Parish Historical Society, made quiet inquiries by post and telephone. Her inquiries, while gentle, were precise, and her tone, always politely vague, had a remarkable way of unlocking doors most firmly shut. It was a technique she had perfected over the years, never asking what one ought not ask, but knowing precisely whom to ask it of. By the Thursday afternoon, a brown paper envelope arrived, bearing the seal of the diocesan archive. Inside were photocopies of 3 handwritten entries from the registers of St. Aldhelm's Home for Girls. The ink had faded in places, but the names were clear enough, and among them, one stood out. Clara Finch, age 16, admitted March 1910. The final notation, dated barely a year later, read only, "Run away, vanished, presumed willful flight." There was no record of inquiry, no mention of a family contacted, no police report, not even a note of internal investigation. For a home under church administration, the absence of procedure was as striking as the absence of the girl herself. Miss Marple sat in quiet contemplation for some time after reading it. Names like Clara Finch did not simply disappear. Girls may run, but their steps leave echoes, in frightened letters, in stark recollections, in the quiet guilt of those who did not protect them. And more than the lack of closure, it was the language used that lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Presumed willful flight. Such words, she knew, were often chosen not for accuracy, but for convenience, by those who wished a matter to be closed before it was truly understood. The following Sunday brought a quiet revelation, hidden in one of the most unassuming places imaginable. Miss Marple, perusing the hymnals in the chapel library, had paused to consider a particular edition, known for its misnumbered index. As she leafed through the pages, absently at first, her hand came upon something folded and yellowed with age. It was a page, torn neatly from a diary, lined and penned in the hand of a young girl. The ink had faded, and a blot marred the lower corner, but the writing was legible, its tone a mixture of youthful devotion and quiet dread. It began plainly, 21st April. He says he will come tonight. What followed was less coherent but more telling. Mentions of a promise, of the child, and of a man. referred to once only as Father Simon. The name, written in a flourish of urgency, was underlined twice. Miss Marple read it again, slowly, the name circling in her mind like an echo made of smoke. In the clergy, titles such as Father were not always used formally in Anglican circles, especially not in Wiltshire. But among frightened girls, nicknames clung like ivy. And Simon Blythe, by his own reticence, had admitted no prior parishes, no detailed history, no past. Yet here was a page, aged and sincere, that named him in connection to a girl whose record ended in silence. She returned the hymnal carefully to its place, but not before pressing the torn page between the pages of her own diary. There were too many names now. Clara Finch, Simon Blythe, and if her instincts held, another yet unnamed, the child mentioned with such trembling reverence. The past, she thought, was no longer whispering. It was beginning to speak. It was just after morning prayers when the cry went up from the chapel. Young Peter Davies, who had been sent to sweep the nave, found the body, and ran with all the instinct of a child who understands that something is dreadfully amiss. Mr. Pritchard, the chapel's longtime sexton, had been found crumpled at the base of the bell tower, his limbs twisted in unnatural repose, and his spectacles lying a full yard away, one arm bent clean from its frame. Dr. Gibbons was called and pronounced the death as a probable fall, although he admitted in quiet tones that something about the break in the neck suggested an angle inconsistent with an ordinary stumble. The tower stairs were steep, yes, but well-worn and familiar. Pritchard had climbed them for over 20 years with never so much as a sprained ankle. Miss Marple, who arrived shortly thereafter, under the pretext of delivering a basket of lavender pomanders for the vestry, stood some distance off and observed, not the body, but the silence around it. She noted that there were no marks on the ground, suggesting a tumble, no blood, and curiously no obvious attempt at grasping the railings. But it was the expression upon the man's face, frozen not in fear but in weary astonishment, that unsettled her. It was not the look of someone who had slipped. It was the look of someone who had seen something he could neither understand nor resist. And even as the others murmured of accidents and weak ankles, Miss Marple turned her attention to the belfry, and wondered not what had caused Mr. Pritchard to fall, but what he might have discovered moments before his death. As the local constable made his official notes and the Reverend offered soft-voiced prayers, Miss Marple remained quietly beside the edge of the tower door, watching as ever. Not what people said, but what they overlooked. A faint aroma hung in the air, sweet, resinous, unmistakably frankincense. An odd thing, given that no incense had been burned in the chapel since Easter. Yet the scent was present still, clinging like memory to the ancient wood. She noted, too, the floor, dry, clean, undisturbed. No scuff marks, no mud, no hint that another person had climbed or descended the narrow steps during the morning. And yet Mr. Pritchard had not fallen by accident. Of that she was quite sure. Later that afternoon, as Mrs. Weatherby sorted through the deceased man's personal effects, a small object fell from the pocket of his overcoat. It was a bead, rosy pink, with a slight opalescence, and all too familiar. Miss Marple, on being shown it, turned it gently in her palm. It was identical to the rosary she had unearthed in Widow Carter's garden. Identical, save for the fact that that one had been missing a bead. Now it was no longer missing, and it had somehow found its way into a dead man's coat. It was not uncommon for Miss Marple to take tea in the vicarage garden. The shrub roses had matured admirably that year, and the clergyman's wife was always glad of company, that could speak with equal fluency on morality and mildew. It was during one such visit, perhaps 3 days before Mr. Pritchard's death, that Miss Marple had looked up from her needlepoint to observe a brief, tense exchange unfolding just beyond the parlor window. Mr. Pritchard stood quite close to Reverend Blythe, his arms folded with an uncommon firmness. The clergyman, though attempting to appear composed, had the strained expression of a man forced into a corner. No voices had risen, and no gestures were made. But there had been something in the lines of Mr. Pritchard's mouth that suggested disapproval, fierce and unsparing. A churchman's conscience perhaps stirred to judgment. Miss Marple had not spoken of it at the time. Arguments, after all, occur even among the devout. But now, with the man dead, a rosary bead in his coat, and a scent of incense where no incense ought to be, she could not help but wonder. What had the sexton confronted the Reverend about? And more importantly, what had the Reverend feared he might reveal? Inspector Graves was not an unkind man, but his methods, though competent, lacked the subtlety that St. Mary Mead required. Having attended to accidents, burglaries, and the occasional misdirected cow in his tenure, he approached the sudden death of Mr. Pritchard with measured briskness. After a brief inspection of the tower and its surroundings, he pronounced it a regrettable but unremarkable fall, slippery stone perhaps, or overexertion, man his age and the stairs that steep. To most ears it was a reasonable explanation. There were no witnesses, no sign of violence, and nothing outwardly criminal. But Miss Marple's instincts, honed not by suspicion but by decades of watching human nature unfold, stirred with quiet dissent. She thought of the incense, the bead in the coat, and the curious rigidity of Reverend Blythe's jaw when Graves had suggested holding a memorial. These were not details a policeman would notice, but they were precisely the sort of things a spinster in a village of long memories would find impossible to ignore. And if Inspector Graves had drawn a neat line around the facts, Miss Marple knew only too well that truth, especially in moral matters, had a habit of refusing to stay inside the lines. Lily, the vicarage maid, was a girl of discretion, but not indifference. Though her eyes rarely met those of her superiors, they missed very little, and as Miss Marple knew, it was often the quiet ones who caught the most. It was during a moment of hushed candor, perhaps prompted by grief, or merely the unburdening that comes when one senses a confidant, that Lily revealed something she had not intended to keep. She had been collecting laundry from the guest room early one morning when she paused outside Reverend Blythe's door. From within came the unmistakable sound of distressed muttering, words slurred by sleep, yet spoken with intensity. "I didn't mean to hurt her," the Reverend had whispered, again and again. She wouldn't stop crying. She wouldn't stop. The repetition chilled her. The voice was raw, laden not with fury but with sorrow. A man haunted not by anger, but by consequence. Miss Marple listened carefully, nodding just once. It was not a confession, legally speaking, but it was enough. For in her long experience, men rarely speak of such things in their dreams, unless the truth, however long buried, has begun to claw its way to the surface. In the quiet of her parlor, with the clatter of teacups muffled by thought, Miss Marple spread before her the slender collection of facts she had so far acquired. Clara Finch, a name long vanished from official record but preserved in whispers, letters, and one torn diary page. The timeline, though fragmented, began to take shape. A girl of 16, placed at St. Aldhelm's in 1910. A pregnancy, perhaps, concealed under the watchful eye of the matron, and no doubt shrouded in moral silence. A clergyman, likely young, involved beyond his vows. Her disappearance, recorded but never truly questioned. It was too convenient. Girls may run, yes, but not without shoes, without fare, without a word to anyone. And Clara, by all accounts, had written letters up until the day she vanished. Miss Marple traced a finger along the edge of the rosary bead, now kept in a drawer beside her handkerchiefs. The missing bead, the child's mention in the diary, the silver locket, all pointed not to escape, but to erasure. Her life quietly removed, not by accident, but by design. And once again she returned to Reverend Blythe. Not as a murderer, no, but perhaps as a man who had buried more than just sins. The hearth in the guest room had not been lit for weeks. The weather, while brisk, had not warranted it, and the housemaid had been instructed to leave it untouched. It was Lily again who noticed the charred remains tucked beneath the grate. A clump of scorched paper, faintly curled at the edges, its ink blurred but not entirely erased. Miss Marple called discreetly to examine it, crouched with the aid of her cane, and retrieved what she could. The largest piece, preserved in part by the folds, bore the end of a message. "If the child speaks, we both hang." There was no salutation, no signature, only the ghost of a sentence, blackened and bitter, with the unmistakable tone of desperation. Miss Marple stared at it for a long time before rising. The implications were dreadful, and yet they fit, each word binding tightly with the narrative she had begun to assemble. This was not merely a case of vanishing innocence or buried regret. This was protection, ruthless and sustained, of a reputation, of a secret, and of a child whose silence had once been forced, and whose memory now returned in beads, in incense, and in broken whispers. And something told her the silence was beginning to crack. Colonel Braithwaite, once the terror of the regimental mess, and now a fixture of the chess club, had grown markedly less coherent in recent years. His memory wavered like the flame of a candle nearing its wick, sometimes sharp, sometimes no more than smoke. But now and then, amid discussions of battalions and bridge hands, he uttered things that struck a dissonant note. It was during a casual afternoon visit, ostensibly to return a borrowed volume on Roman military strategy, that Miss Marple overheard a remark that made her pause. The colonel, without context or prompt, had said softly to no one in particular, "That priest, he said it was penance, for her, for him, for all of us." He then returned to muttering about port rations, and forgot he had spoken. Miss Marple, with her polite nods and unobtrusive presence, took this utterance as something far more than the ramblings of age. The colonel had served, she recalled, on the board of St. Aldhelm's Home. His memory may have failed him in many respects, but guilt, she knew, had a remarkable way of surviving all else. And if a man remembered penance when all else faded, it suggested that penance had not been completed. It was not Miss Marple who questioned Mrs. Weatherby. Rather, it was the older woman herself who spoke, slowly, deliberately. One quiet evening after evensong, the conversation had begun with flowers, as most safe ones did, then drifted to the topic of girls' homes and the difficulties of maintaining discipline among the young. Mrs. Weatherby, long assumed to have been a nurse at some point in her early life, disclosed, after some hesitation, that she had once worked at St. Aldhelm's, only briefly, only one term. She described long corridors, beds in neat rows, and a matron whose manner was more administrative than maternal. But what stayed with her most, what eventually drove her to leave, were the nights. "There was a child who cried," she said, her voice distant, almost brittle. "Not out of hunger or hurt, but fear. Every night, until she was silenced." She did not elaborate, and Miss Marple did not press. But her mind was already weaving the strands together. Clara Finch, a priest known by another name, a pregnancy shrouded in secrecy, and a frightened child perhaps hidden rather than acknowledged. Mrs. Weatherby never mentioned names. She didn't need to. The truth had already begun to unearth itself. The silver locket, long hidden beneath the floorboards of the vicarage, had become more than an artifact. It was now a thread, one tied with increasing certainty to Clara Finch. It was Mrs. Bantry, ever resourceful when roused by mystery, who took the photograph to her cousin in Tunbridge Wells, a retired schoolmistress with an impeccable eye for faces. Within days the answer returned. The girl in the locket bore an unmistakable resemblance to a photograph once displayed in the staff room of St. Aldhelm's. Clara Finch, timid, bright, destined, they had set, for some quiet teaching post before she had got herself into trouble. And the lock of hair? Pale gold, fine, clearly not the girl's own. The assumption was made, and not idly, that it belonged to her child. Miss Marple, upon hearing this, said nothing immediately, but she studied the locket for a long while, tracing the edge with a thoughtful finger. Jewelry, she mused, often outlasted sentiment. But this piece, secreted so carefully, meant more. It was a symbol, a silent confession perhaps, or a promise kept in metal when words could no longer be trusted. And someone, Reverend Blythe, if her suspicions held, had once hidden it to bury both memory and truth. By the following Sunday the pulpit had become not a place of comfort, but a theater of reckoning. Reverend Blythe, whose early sermons had been solemn yet measured, now spoke with an urgency that bordered on the apocalyptic. His voice, once controlled, now rose in strange crescendos, and his eyes, restless, red-rimmed, rarely settled on the congregation. He spoke of fire, not the cleansing flame of divine mercy, but of judgment, of burning wheat, of souls scorched for sins unnamed. Atonement, he said, must come not in ritual but in confession. The truth would find its way into the light, even through stone and silence. Some parishioners murmured that he was unwell. Others, more superstitiously inclined, whispered of spiritual possession or divine punishment. But Miss Marple listened without alarm. What she heard was not madness, nor spiritual fervor. It was a man unraveling, one whose sins, long buried, had begun to rot beneath the surface. His words betrayed more than scripture. They spoke of being watched, of being found out, and Miss Marple, quietly counting the patterns of guilt, recognized the precise tone of a man who had once believed himself safe, until the past returned, not with wrath, but with quiet footsteps. The village, still raw from the loss of Mr. Pritchard, was not prepared for another tragedy. Yet it was Lily, gentle, wide-eyed Lily, who was next found lifeless, her body discovered by Mrs. Weatherby during her morning preparations. She had been placed, delicately, almost reverently, in the baptismal font. Her hair still damp, hands folded as if in prayer. No signs of struggle, no bruises, no reason at all, save for a terrible, chilling silence that hung about the chapel walls. The Reverend had not spoken since. He remained in his rooms, refusing visitors. The vicarage seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had requested the hymnals be collected for safekeeping. It was during this quiet task that she found it. Another torn page tucked between Rock of Ages and Oh God, Our Help in Ages Past. The writing was unmistakably the same. Clara Finch's. I mustn't let them hurt her. She cries at night. I'll hide her near the rosemary. She'll be safe there. She must. Miss Marple read it twice, her lips pursed not with shock, but with certainty. The diary, the locket, the garden. Clara had not run. She had remained, long enough to do what mothers do best, and someone had killed Lily for discovering it. That night, as the moon pulled faint light across St. Mary Mead's rooftops, the bell began to toll once more. It came without wind, without hand, and without consent. 12 slow chimes, each weighted, deliberate, and echoing through stone and silence alike. The village stirred uneasily in their beds, half dreaming, half aware that something unholy had broken loose again. But Miss Marple, who sat upright in her chair with her knitting untouched in her lap, did not stir. She knew the hour well. Years ago, nearly to the day, Clara Finch had gone into labor under a locked roof in Wiltshire, unacknowledged, unseen. The hour of the child's birth, recorded only in the midwife's now lost notes, had been whispered to Miss Marple by an old contact days earlier. It was the same. Midnight and 12 minutes. The bell had marked it. And this second tolling she felt in her very bones was not mere symbolism. Someone remembered. Someone within that chapel had returned at that precise time. Perhaps out of remorse, perhaps out of madness, or perhaps because some truths, like guilt, are as relentless as time. Whatever the reason, the hour had come. The bell had spoken. And Miss Marple knew at last that it was nearly time for her to speak as well. The vicar's wife, though never one to indulge in gossip, had a gentle habit of speaking her thoughts aloud, over tea. A trait Miss Marple found not only endearing, but exceedingly useful. On that particular Thursday afternoon, the two ladies sat with a modest spread between them. Seed cake, thinly sliced cucumber sandwiches, and a pot of Darjeeling, brewed to perfection. Conversation drifted, as it always did, from the trivial to the telling. The recent tragedies had unsettled the parish, and the vicar's wife, clutching her teacup with hands slightly less steady than usual, mused upon Lily's devotion, the Reverend's strange decline, and the bell's midnight toll. Miss Marple listened with half a smile, her mind turning slowly. She spoke little, asking only the lightest questions, yet inwardly her deductions were aligning with quiet certainty. The rosemary patch, the diary pages, the locket, the tears of a child, the hand that had hidden, silenced, buried. It was not merely a chain of facts she pursued, but the emotional shape of guilt, the way it lingered in sermons and settled in dreams. And as she sipped her tea and gazed into the garden beyond, she knew that the past had not only returned to St. Mary Mead. It had been there all along, patiently waiting for someone to see. In solitude, Miss Marple preferred order, the neat arrangement of her sewing basket, the symmetry of a well-tended border, the elegance of truth emerging from confusion. And now, as the pieces of the mystery settled around her, she began to see the pattern taking form. The rosemary bush, its roots disturbed not by animals nor weather, had cradled a child's rosary. The locket, wrapped and hidden with intent, bore Clara Finch's likeness, and a lock of golden hair that did not match her own. The diary pages, each torn and concealed, echoed one another with pleas for protection and a maternal desperation no imagination could invent. What emerged from these symbols, earth, silver, ink, was not conjecture but the sorrowful shape of a woman who had not fled, but remain. Clara had stayed long enough to give birth, long enough to hide her child, long enough, perhaps, to love once more before being erased. And someone had known, not suspected, not wondered, known. A man who had donned the cloth not to confess his sins, but to bury them beneath vestments, hymns, and polished sermons. Miss Marple set her teacup down. Clara Finch had not vanished into myth. She had been here. The garden had remembered her. And now, so had justice. There are sins that begin in weakness, and sins that calcify into habit. Reverend Blythe's, Miss Marple now believed, had begun as the former, and ended as the latter. He had been young once, newly ordained, and posted to a girl's home where loneliness passed as duty, and admiration easily transformed into affection. Clara Finch, intelligent and sensitive, had found herself noticed by a man whose color lent him both authority and allure. What began as a kindness became something else, something that yielded a child, and inevitably, shame. For a man such as Simon Blythe, shame could not be endured, and so he had crafted silence, not by cruelty alone but by the soft coercion of religious authority and the insidious weight of social ruin. Clara's pleas had fallen not on deaf ears, but on fearful ones. She was hidden, perhaps dismissed, perhaps worse. And when rumors stirred, and guilt returned as memory, he sought refuge in the cloth, not as a penitent but as a man who believed that piety could drown out consequence. But sins buried beneath cassocks are not forgotten. They echo, in bells, in broken girls, in gardens thick with rosemary. And Miss Marple knew. What he had silenced then was speaking now, louder than ever. Mr. Pritchard had served the church faithfully, but never sentimentally. He was a man who understood not just the rituals of faith, but the undercurrents of power. And as Miss Marple quietly reconstructed his final days, she began to see how the sexton had positioned himself, not as a whistleblower, but as a man with leverage. The locket, perhaps unearthed while mending floorboards, the diary page discovered in a forgotten hymnal, the scent of incense, burned maybe in a private ceremony of remembrance. Each fragment, to someone less shrewd, would have signified mystery. To Mr. Pritchard they meant opportunity. Miss Marple believed he confronted Reverend Blythe not with accusation but with implication. A knowing glance, a remark half-spoken, enough to unsettle, enough to control. But blackmail, especially when wielded by the righteous, treads a dangerous edge. And somewhere between threat and silence, between penance and fear, the Reverend acted. Pritchard fell, or was made to fall. And Blythe once more had protected himself, not through cleverness but through desperation. The rosary bead in the coat, the incense in the air, the bell that would not rest. These were not mere signs. They were confessions, silent, damning, and finally, ready to be heard. With each day, Lily's death became more difficult to classify as anything other than deliberate. Though some whispered of fragile nerves and poor constitution, Miss Marple had long abandoned such notions. Lily had been frightened, yes, but not enough to end her own life. She had been careful, observant, and above all, loyal. It was what she had overheard that condemned her. Miss Marple, in reviewing the accounts of Lily's last week, noted the increasing irregularity of her habits. The tray left outside the Reverend's door instead of brought in, the quiet steps at unusual hours, a reluctance to speak, and that trembling admission of a voice behind the door repeating, "She wouldn't stop crying." It was not the child that threatened Reverend Blythe. It was the memory of the child, Clara's child. And Lily, unknowingly, had uncovered just enough of it to become dangerous. Fear, Miss Marple knew, is a powerful motivator, not hatred, not wrath, just fear, of exposure, of ruin, of divine reckoning masquerading as scandal. And so the font had been chosen, perhaps in twisted irony. A vessel of cleansing turned to silence, but Lily had not died in vain. Her whispers had become Miss Marple's certainty, and now it was time for truth to take its proper shape. Miss Marple did not accuse. She did not demand or confront or name names in parlor rooms. Instead, she wrote, by hand and with elegance, a short note to the vicar's wife, suggesting that in light of recent sorrows, a memorial service might bring the village some solace, a shared moment of remembrance. It was not difficult to arrange. St. Mary Mead, after all, knew how to mourn with grace. The entire village was invited, but only a few were specifically summoned. Reverend Blythe, pale and diminished, Colonel Braithwaite, wheeled in with dignity, Mrs. Weatherby, quiet but watchful. They gathered beneath the same vaulted ceiling where guilt had once trembled and sermons had faltered. There was no formal eulogy, only prayer, reflection, and silence. Miss Marple stood at the rear, unnoticed by most, but acutely present. She watched faces as scripture was read, her eyes lingering not on the grief-stricken, but on those burdened by secrets. She had stitched the truth together not with evidence, but with grief, motive, and the smallest inconsistencies. This gathering was not merely one of memory. It was the final thread. And before the chapel doors closed, Miss Marple knew the time for revelation had come. The reckoning, long deferred, was now within reach. The air in the chapel was still, as though reluctant to stir before what was to come. The villagers sat neatly in their pews, hats modest, collars straightened, eyes lowered not in reverence, but in weary anticipation. The week's events had left them subdued, less talkative, more alert. Tragedy, in a place as intimate as St. Mary Mead, did not pass unnoticed. It nested quietly in the walls. At the front, the altar stood dressed in white linen, a single candle lit in remembrance. The Reverend Blythe took his place behind the lectern, with movements that betrayed neither strength nor clarity. His expression was a study in detachment, eyes glassy, voice faint, shoulders drawn inward as if bracing against some unseen tide. Miss Marple did not occupy her usual place. Instead, she stood by the side aisle, unassuming but steady, her hands clasped loosely before her. She had asked for no permission, made no announcement. Yet when she stepped forward, her tone calm, her words precise, the congregation gave way to silence. What followed was not accusation. It was revelation, gently woven, plainly laid, a recollection of names long buried, of beads and rosemary, of cries in the dark and locketed hair, of Lily, of Clara, and the eyes that turned upon her, including those of the man behind the pulpit, did not challenge. They simply listened. There are truths which, once spoken aloud, seem almost too fragile to carry the weight of what they mean. And yet, when Miss Marple told them, without flourish or pity, they landed gently, undeniably, upon the minds that received them. She spoke of Clara Finch, a girl of intelligence, affection, and quiet charm, a girl once admired by a young curate, newly posted, idealistic and foolish, a girl who, in the secrecy of institutional corridors and under the pretense of pastoral care, bore not only affection, but consequence. The child had come in silence. No announcements, no baptism, no records beyond what had been discreetly edited. The Reverend Blythe, known then by another name, had helped conceal the matter. Not out of violence, but out of fear. Fear of disgrace, fear of losing a future he believed was still within reach. Clara, dismissed quietly under the veil of disobedience, was sent away. But she did not go far. She remained, at least for a time, under the kindness of another, a nurse perhaps, or a friend, and bore her child, in hiding. The rosemary, long grown wild in Widow Carter's garden, had once stood watch over them both. And Miss Marple, pausing briefly before continuing, let the congregation feel it, that a child had been born not in sin, but in secrecy. And secrecy, as she well knew, is the first betrayal. Miss Marple continued without haste, her voice unwavering, though the weight of the tale began to settle heavily across the room. She explained that Clara, at first resigned, had grown determined. Time and motherhood had awakened in her a new clarity. She no longer wished to disappear. She wanted recognition, for the child, for herself, and for the truth that had been hidden too long beneath the iron folds of reputation. She had written, she had asked to meet, she had threatened, gently, perhaps tearfully, but threatened nonetheless. She no longer feared scandal, but the man she once loved, now a rising figure in clerical ranks, feared it still. What happened next was not described in detail. Miss Marple offered no melodrama, no speculation. Only this: Clara Finch was last seen in St. Mary Mead, beneath the shadow of the chapel. No carriage arrived for her. No train ticket was ever used. Her child was left in the care of another, then moved again. And the Reverend, by then newly renamed and transferred, was never questioned. Her voice lowered, not for effect, but out of respect. The past, Miss Marple said, is never buried completely. It seeps into dreams, into sermons, into bells that ring at the hour a child once cried. And now, Clara had spoken once more, not through voice but through the lives her silence had shattered. The congregation remained still, but Miss Marple, who had not yet finished, looked toward Reverend Blythe, and she knew. He was ready to answer. As Miss Marple turned the narrative's thread, her voice softened, not with uncertainty, but with the gravity reserved for the few souls who had done right in the face of quiet horror. Widow Carter, she revealed, had once worked as a seamstress within St. Aldhelm's home. A woman of few words but sharp instincts, she had grown concerned over Clara's increasing distress, her isolation, and the way certain staff members looked away when the Reverend passed too close. It was Widow Carter who found Clara after the child was born. Not in ceremony, not in welcome, but in desperation. Beneath an old shawl, and a prayer whispered through tears. She had acted not as a rescuer, but as a shield. She brought Clara and the child to St. Mary Mead, under the guise of a distant relation's convalescence. There, for a brief time, they were safe. But safety, like spring blossom, is short-lived in the shadow of fear. When whispers grew and questions came too near, Clara insisted the child be sent elsewhere, a cottage in the north, an unmarried cousin, papers left unsigned. The girl disappeared from record but not from memory. Widow Carter never spoke of it, not even when Clara herself vanished, not even when Reverend Blythe returned under a new name. She bore the weight in silence, tended her rosemary, and waited for the past to catch up. And when it did, when her body was found bruised in her own garden, it was not her death that mattered most. It was her remembering. Miss Marple did not excuse Mr. Pritchett, but neither did she condemn him entirely. He had been a hard man, yes, practical to a fault, and proud of his control over the church's quiet mechanisms. Yet he had never aspired to cruelty, only leverage. Some months before his death he had begun repairs in the vestry floor. In doing so, he had dislodged the old locket, wrapped in cloth, untouched by time, bearing the image of a girl no one wished to remember. He said nothing, not immediately, but Miss Marple believed that something shifted in him from that moment. Whether by accident or design, he pieced it together. Perhaps he found a diary page mislaid and never burned. Perhaps he saw Reverend Blythe, late one night, slipping incense into the brazier, an old ritual for a buried sin. Whatever the order, the result was clear. Mr. Pritchard knew. Unknowing, he waited. He had no intention of reporting the matter. He would never air dirty linen in public, least of all sacred linen. But he made his knowledge felt, a sharp comment, a lingering pause, enough to cause Blythe's eyes to flicker and his sermons to falter. Miss Marple suspected it began as quiet power, but became something more. Perhaps money changed hands. Perhaps it didn't. Either way, Reverend Blythe, who had suppressed scandal once before, understood that silence could be purchased or removed. Mr. Pritchard's fall from the bell tower was not a fall at all. It was the end of a negotiation, and with his death, the final wall between Blythe and exposure crumbled. There was no evidence, no wound, no witness. But Miss Marple, who had once been a girl herself, knew what it meant to stumble across something one was not meant to know. Lily, sweet-natured and dutiful, had been entrusted with tasks beyond her rank: tea trays, linens, the turning down of bed covers. Small gestures that, over time, drew her nearer to the private rhythms of the house. She heard the murmurs behind doors, the sighs of unrest, the creak of pacing in sleepless corridors. She had paused once too long near Reverend Blythe's study. She had heard something she could not reconcile. Miss Marple did not suppose that Lily understood all she'd overheard. She may not have known Clara Finch by name, but she recognized guilt when it rose from a man's lips, trembling and barely spoken. "I didn't mean to hurt her," he had said. "She wouldn't stop crying." Such words, even murmured in sleep, settle heavily upon the listener. Lily, frightened but resolute, told no one, except in time perhaps Widow Carter. Or perhaps she said nothing at all, simply moved differently, looked too long, stepped too lightly. And that, Miss Marple said with quiet clarity, was enough. The baptismal font had once symbolized rebirth. But for Lily, it became a place of ending, chosen not for its symbolism alone, but for its proximity. The Reverend could not confess, but he could erase. And Lily had seen too much to be left in peace. The chapel emptied slowly. The villagers departed with silence pressed to their lips, shaken not by spectacle, but by the realization of what had lived among them, undetected and unresolved. Reverend Blythe did not flee. He stood as Miss Marple spoke, pale and trembling, and at the final word he lowered his head and uttered a confession, not for the law, but for the chapel walls. "I lied to God," he said softly. "I thought if I served him enough, he would forget." He did not resist when Inspector Graves stepped forward. There were no handcuffs, no declaration, just a long silence, followed by quiet footsteps down the nave. Miss Marple remained. She approached the altar not as a victor, but as a witness. She lit a single candle, no different from the others, except for the steadiness with which it burned. "For Clara," she murmured, though no one heard. "Not for justice in the public sense, but for dignity long denied." The wax began to melt, and outside, the spring wind rustled the rosemary in the garden, Miss Marple folded her hands. Some stories, she knew, did not require vengeance, only remembrance. The days that followed were marked not by scandal, but by a strange and welcome stillness. The Reverend was quietly removed, neither vilified nor defended, and St. Mary Mead turned once again to the dependable rhythms of hedgerow trimming, milk delivery, and afternoon knitting circles. But in corners where quiet truths had been long buried, something gentle had begun to grow. Widow Carter, her wrist still bound from that mysterious foal in her garden, returned to the churchyard not with words, but with seeds. She said little to those who passed, only nodding once or twice, her eyes shaded beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. But her hands, despite the bandage, moved with renewed care. She brought rosemary, tall and thick, from a patch she'd tended for decades, and planted it near the edge of the south wall. Beside it, a circle of soft lavender, like breath returned to stone. No plaque, no name. But everyone came to call it Clara's Corner. The children, of course, asked who Clara was. The adults did not answer directly, though Miss Marple once overheard Mrs. Bantry murmur, "A girl who should have been remembered sooner." In time the plants took root. Visitors paused longer at that spot, not because they knew the full story, but because something in the arrangement, modest, fragrant, quietly persistent, told them all they needed. Miss Marple, passing one morning with a basket of preserves for the vicar's wife, lingered briefly there. The rosemary had already begun to flower. She did not smile, but her chin lifted slightly. There are graves, after all, that hold nothing. And yet, some corners bloom with more truth than any headstone could declare. It came in a pale blue envelope, the handwriting unfamiliar but neatly formed. Addressed to the parish of St. Mary Mead, Hampshire. It arrived with the vicar's morning post and was nearly mistaken for a wedding invitation. But the vicar's wife, curious by nature and unsettled still by recent events, read it aloud that afternoon in the drawing room. It was a letter from Canada, from a woman who had once been a child, unnamed, unrecognized, yet not unloved. She had grown up in modest comfort, adopted by distant cousins of Widow Carter's brother-in-law. She had never known her mother, not truly, only fragments, a silver locket, which arrived 1 year on her birthday. A line in a will, referring to a daughter placed in care for protection. She had searched once or twice, then stopped. The past, she had been told, was better left quiet. But recently a solicitor had reached out, her reverend arrested, a mystery resolved, a name restored. The letter was not dramatic. It did not accuse. It did not yearn. It simply thanked the parish for remembering. She wrote of the strange comfort she now felt, knowing that her mother had not abandoned her, but had fought and protected and suffered in silence, and that now, at last, her name, Clara Finch, had found its way back into the light. Miss Marple, having heard the reading, closed her eyes for a moment and placed her teacup down with care. There were many forms of justice, she thought, and sometimes it came in envelopes, folded gently, written in grace, and arriving precisely when a village and a daughter were ready to receive it. It was a quiet afternoon when Miss Marple and the vicar sat in the garden once more, the tea between them left mostly untouched. The sun was gentle, the birds sung tentative, as if the world had not yet decided whether to resume its cheerful hum. The vicar, his hands folded more loosely than before, spoke not of sin or scandal but of burdens, how some are imposed and some chosen. He confessed to having suspected something was amiss, though he'd lacked the shape of it. A shadow in Blythe's gaze, a sermon too fervent. But like many men of the cloth, he had mistaken restraint for virtue. Miss Marple, who had never mistaken silence for peace, replied simply that guilt was a seed. It did not die in the dark, but grew. They talked too of Lily, of girls like Clara, of all those whose stories had once been dismissed as inconvenient or imagined, or irrelevant. The vicar nodded gravely, then offered her another slice of seed cake. Miss Marple declined. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on locketed hair, on hidden rosaries, on bells that told from more than time, and as the tea cooled between them, something in the air had already warmed. The rosemary stirred faintly in the breeze. Miss Marple sat alone now, her teacup in hand, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond the window. The light caught the leaves just so, casting long lines across the paving stones like unwritten verse. There had been cruelty, yes, and cowardice, but also protection, resilience, remembrance. Some stories, she thought, end not with triumph or punishment, but with restoration. She stirred her tea once, gently, then leaned back in her chair as the garden swayed softly beneath the spring sun. Justice, she thought, not shouted, not forced, had bloomed again, and this time it had been allowed to grow. Even in a village as small and peaceful as St. Mary Mead, silence can carry the weight of unspeakable truths. This story was never just about a murder. It was about a child hidden in shame, a woman forgotten by time, and a priest who mistook secrecy for salvation. And yet, through the quiet perseverance of Miss Marple, dignity was returned to the dead, and justice, though delayed, was not denied. In the end, it was not the loudest voice, but the gentlest gaze that saw clearly. A broken locket. And that concludes today's journey into the shadows of mystery and deduction. What did you think of this case? Did you see the twist coming, or did it catch you by surprise? Share your theories and favorite moments in the comments below. Love to hear your take. And if you're craving more thrilling detective tales, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. Until then, stay curious. The next clue might be closer than you think it.